old fiend. You'll walk not one more step toward the light of day, so long as I am here.
2 against 1. Seems hardly fair. Ah, well. Let's kill him and be done, King.
Theseus, the Bull of Minos, you two are legend.
In Greek mythology, Theseus was the king and founder hero of Athens. There are a variety of different myths involving him, from his conception to his death, but arguably the most famous is that of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. After his oldest son was killed at the Athenian Games, Minos, the king of Crete, forced Agis, the king of Athens, to sacrifice their 7 bravest young men and 7 most beautiful young women to Crete as tribute. This sacrifice happens every 7 years or every 9 years, depending on the version. Theseus, Agis' son, has arrived in Athens and met his father shortly before the 3rd tribute. Theseus then takes the place of one of the young men, determined to put an end to the sacrifices. Again, the details vary depending on the source material. Sometimes the Athenians know the tributes are fed to the Minotaur, sometimes they don't. Sometimes Theseus plans to talk to the Minotaur to end the horror, sometimes he plans to talk to Minos. Either way, he ends up on the ship bound for Crete. Before he leaves, Agis tells him to change the ship's black sails to white ones should he return home victorious. When Theseus and the other tributes arrive in Crete, he participates in the Cretan Games and impresses everyone with his athletic abilities, particularly in wrestling, for which he had invented the strategy referred to as scientific wrestling. At this point, Minos offers Theseus his freedom as a reward, but Theseus refuses. He now intends to kill the Minotaur. It's usually at this point that Ariadne, the oldest daughter of Minos, falls in love with Theseus and decides to help him. She sneaks Theseus a ball of string, a clue of thread, which is where today's word clue stems from, and tells him how to navigate the famously unnavigable labyrinth, built to house the Minotaur by the genius inventor Daedalus. Theseus promises to collect Ariadne after killing the Minotaur and take her back to Athens with him where she will be his wife. The Minotaur, by the way, is Ariadne's brother Asterion, half man, half bull. Years before, Minos had been sent a beautiful snow-white bull by Poseidon, to whom he was supposed to then sacrifice it. But Minos decided to keep the bull instead, figuring that the god would accept a substitute bull. Spoiler alert, he didn't. To punish Minos, Poseidon made Pasiphae, Minos' wife, fall in love with the bull. Pasiphae in turn had Daedalus build a hollow wooden cow in which she could hide. The bull then mated with her, and the Minotaur was the result. No one can accuse ancient Greeks of phoning it in when it came to wanting to fuck something. They really embodied the whole if there's a will, there's a way concept. In most Greek sources, the Minotaur is presented with a bull's head on a man's body, while Italian texts typically describe the opposite. Either way, not really something you want to run into in the dark. Theseus manages to kill the Minotaur, in some sources strangling it, in others stabbing it in the neck, and then uses the string to find his way back. He escapes Crete with the other Athenians, Ariadne, and Ariadne's younger sister Phaedra, and they sail to a nearby island where they all fall asleep. In most versions, Theseus then forgets about the still sleeping Ariadne and leaves without her. In some, he leaves her behind purposefully after she's claimed by the god Dionysus, though usually Dionysus doesn't discover her until Theseus has already left. In almost every version, she goes on to marry Dionysus and lives happily with him. Upon sailing back to Athens, Theseus forgets to change his sails to white, and his father, thinking his son was unsuccessful and has died, throws himself into the sea. Today, that body of water is called the Aegean Sea. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur has been told and retold over the centuries, and for good reason. It's a banger. But I'm only going to be analyzing 8 retellings, from 1932 to 2021. I'll be focusing specifically on the representation of Theseus, Minos, Ariadne, the Minotaur, and the labyrinth in each. Ariadne by F.L. Lucas. This epic poem, originally published in 1932 with a limited run of 500 copies, spans from Theseus' arrival in Athens to Ariadne's departure from him on the island of Naxos. It switches from Theseus' point of view to Ariadne's about 2/3 of the way through, and it could be argued that the book should be named for him instead, but Lucas's depiction of Ariadne is so complex and compelling that I understand his choice. Theseus in this poem is uncomplicated but not boring. He is ruled by his heart and quick to fall in love, and then fall in love with someone new, though he is never cruel about it. The story opens with his arrival in Athens and dramatic introduction to Agis. Like in the original myth, Medea, Agis' consort, who fled to Athens after murdering her children, attempts to trick Agis into killing his own son, having convinced him that Theseus was a villain. Upon seeing Theseus' sword, a gift Agis had left for his unborn child, he realizes the truth and stops the assassination. Medea then flees Athens with her own children. His portrayal of Medea in this moment is very interesting. Even though she only has a brief cameo, her monologue is both sympathetic and arresting. She says, "These 13 years, I came a fugitive. You saved me. What repayment could I give? Myself. Have I not given? You weep upon his neck. Have we no child? So Jason too betrayed me, twice beguiled. Such is Greek faith, such is Greek loyalty." This is interesting because in Theseus' story, Medea is a clear-cut villain. It would be easy, and in fact has been in the past, to make her a one-note wicked stepmother/evil queen type. Yet Lucas writes her not just bitter, but wronged. She put in the time and the work as Agis' consort. She bore his children. But here comes this son he's never known, and suddenly she and her kids are worth nothing. I'm not saying she was right to scam Agis into filicide, a crime she knows well, but in this poem, we can understand her frustration. Shortly after Medea escapes, the time for tribute shadows Athens. Theseus, upon learning what the tribute entails, boards the Cretan ship voluntarily, much to Agis' dismay. On the voyage to Crete, Theseus falls in love with Agele, one of the Athenian women meant to be sacrificed. Their love story is sweet and short, and their attitudes towards it refreshing. When Theseus swears to love Agele forever, she says, "Ah, love, forget tomorrow, waste not breath. To say you will love me always, can you know? Yet bless you, that you dream it, wish it so." Finally, someone who says, "Hold up, it's only been like 2 days, we need to chill." On their arrival to Crete, the Athenians are brought into the palace to be looked over by Minos. There, Theseus first tries to move Minos with his words, and then with a spear, only to be thwarted by Ariadne, who places her hand between the blade and her father. Unlike in the original myth, where Ariadne is impressed by Theseus, here Theseus is impressed by her. She is also impressed by Theseus, but whatever. The point is, the admiration, shock, and intrigue is mutual. That night, Ariadne is seized by a passion she's never felt before, so taken that she's nearly sick with it. Literally sick in love with Theseus, and all the worse for it, because she does genuinely love her father, and to love one is to betray the other. She agonizes over this for hours before she finally decides to help Theseus. After Ariadne gives him the clue and a kiss, she waits for him to succeed so they can depart for Athens. Phaedra does also appear in this poem, and I love her relationship with Ariadne. They clearly adore each other, with Phaedra being much younger and Ariadne protective, but ultimately Phaedra stays behind in Crete. On Theseus' ship, after killing the Minotaur and saving the other Athenians, he relays to Ariadne what happened in the labyrinth. There was no Minotaur in the end. There was only Minos in a bull mask, which Theseus didn't realize until after he had killed him. He's very apologetic while telling this to Ariadne, knowing that, despite her betrayal, she did still love her father. Ariadne's feelings are complicated. She cannot begrudge Theseus for killing the monster that had been murdering his people for decades, but she cannot forgive him for killing her father. That they are one and the same makes no difference. They stop by Naxos, where the drama with Aigle comes to a head. She is heartbroken that Theseus moved on so quickly with Ariadne and kills herself out of despair. Theseus in turn is heartbroken by this, and Ariadne is sympathetic, though never self-blaming. Personally, I felt the suicide cheapened the story a bit. Hadn't Aigle been the one to say, "You don't know what tomorrow may bring"? She'd had a relatively relaxed attitude about their short-lived romance. I found it hard to believe she'd kill herself over it. In the end, Ariadne decides to leave Theseus in search of her own adventure and, possibly, a grand love story. Essentially, she tells Theseus that though she loves him, they won't be good together, and wouldn't it be better to part as friends? Theseus agrees and wishes her the best. Ariadne's ending is left open. She may have found her way to Dionysus, or she may not. Either way, she made the decision. This poem grants Ariadne a remarkable amount of agency, considering it was written by a man in the 30s. She is allowed to love her father despite his wickedness, and she is allowed to leave Theseus rather than get left behind. She also, wonder of wonders, doesn't end up married to anyone. She is allowed to exist happily as a free single woman on her own terms. Theseus, meanwhile, is the kind of Prince Charming that almost deserves the title. This depiction of Minos is interesting in that rather than menacing, he simply seems tired. Minos being the Minotaur all along is endlessly fascinating to me. Did he kill because he liked it, or because he felt it was necessary? Did Daedalus know? The labyrinth itself doesn't play much of a part in this poem, as we are outside with Ariadne for all of the action, and Theseus never describes it to her, but I don't think its absence weakens the story. I actually searched for a free copy of this book for 2 months before one of my friends decided to just buy it for me. It's hard to find unless you're willing to pay, but if you can manage to get your hands on a copy, I highly recommend it. Los Reyes by Julio Cortázar, translated by Juan Sebastián de Vivo. In 1949, iconic Argentine writer Julio Cortázar published his Theseus and the Minotaur retelling in the form of a play called Los Reyes, or The Kings in English. Cortázar's interpretation of the myth is by far the darkest on this list, consisting mostly of a conversation between Theseus and Minos, hence the title. It is also the most sympathetic to the Minotaur, more man than beast in this play. Los Reyes opens with a conversation between Minos and Ariadne in which they discuss the approaching Athenian tributes and the Minotaur. They clearly each hold disdain for the other. Minos, in particular, views Ariadne only as an extension of himself, and the Minotaur a mindless beast with no connection to their family. Here we see the first mention of Asterion as anything other than a monster. Ariadne says, "Why do you fear him? He is my brother." When Minos reminds her that her brother eats people, she says, "How is he to live without eating?" The Athenian tribute arrives then, and Theseus approaches Minos as an equal. Two kings discussing the Minotaur and fate. Fate is its own sort of character in Greek myths, forcing everyone along the current of its narrative. Theseus at first compels Minos to see his reasoning, as he believes them to be alike. They are both, after all, kings. He believes he is fated to kill the Minotaur as he has killed every other obstacle in his path. Such is the way of the Greek hero. He says, "I am a hero. That is reason enough." Minos says, "That is why there are so few." Eventually, Minos acquiesces to Theseus's plan to kill the Minotaur. After all, Minos also hates and is frightened of Asterion. But Theseus retracts his earlier assertion that he and Minos are alike. He has remembered Minos' part in the deaths of innocent Athenians, and, believing himself above such crimes, now holds Minos in contempt. Minos, however, admits they are similar. He will allow Theseus to kill the Minotaur, but only if Theseus keeps the beast's death a secret, so Minos can continue to wield fear of Asterion as his weapon against the other kingdoms. In return, he will give Theseus Ariadne, whom Theseus has admitted to desiring. Kill him, and hold his death like a stone in your hand. Conceal his death? You think Theseus can return to Athens without word of that other vanquished monster spreading? You will return with Ariadne and with your heart in peace. Think, with Ariadne and with your heart in peace. The island's free of monsters, because he is the last. And the city is always in fear, the Athenians continuing the annual tribute. Later, I would forgive this. There are always Africans to feed the monster's reputation. No longer any monster alive. Solid, our thrones. No monster alive, only men. Men, buttresses of thrones. And you would give me Ariadne. See if we are not alike. The misogyny and racism from both kings is blatant. The play is a scathing critique of the Greek notions of good and bad kings. Coming from noted socialist Cortázar, the meaning is evident. There is no such thing as a good king. Both Minos and Theseus care only for their own people, perfectly fine with the murder of foreign innocents. Both are willing to kill and manipulate for their own benefits. Both see Ariadne as something to be bought or sold. Both see Asterion as a monster. The hero is the villain, and vice versa. Ariadne is actually present for this whole scene, which you almost wouldn't realize as she does and says nothing. She has no voice around Theseus. In fact, they never speak to one another. Ariadne has her own scene following the king's agreement, in which she has given Theseus the thread, which he takes indifferently into the labyrinth. Outside, Ariadne soliloquizes to herself, worrying over her brother and disdaining Theseus. She mentions that she told him, "If you speak to him, tell him that this thread is a gift from Ariadne." It quickly becomes clear that Ariadne does not want Theseus to succeed, and in fact hopes for Asterion to kill him and follow the thread back to her so they can be together at last. Meanwhile, in the labyrinth, Theseus and the Minotaur have their own conversation. Theseus offers to kill him kindly if he does not put up a fight. The Minotaur, on the other hand, debates his options. Should he continue to live when life has always been a prison? Or should he die and thus be free? Theseus cannot understand the Minotaur, and the Minotaur cannot make him understand. After all, Theseus is a hero, and the Minotaur is not. He elects to let Theseus kill him, rationalizing that death will not be the end, but only a borderless, freeing existence. Theseus cuts his neck, though the Minotaur does not die immediately. Next, we see the Minotaur alone as he lays dying, described as the Minotaur agonizes, no matter what Theseus said. Timidly, other people approach him. Now we understand. The Minotaur hasn't eaten the past sacrifices after all. Instead, he had taken care of them and formed a sort of society within the labyrinth. The leader of this group is referred only as a citharist, which is a musician that sang and played a type of lyre. The Athenians are obviously upset and grieving, having grown to love the Minotaur. The Minotaur admonishes them, explaining that there will be no point in mourning or remembering him, as his spirit will go on in other forms. Eventually, the Minotaur dies, and the Athenians mourn even though, and perhaps especially because, they know this means they will likely be rescued and returned to Athens. They realize no one will ever truly understand their time in the labyrinth with the Minotaur. This version of Theseus is the most villainous I've ever read, even if his faults lay more in the vein of unthinkingly causing pain rather than outright malice. To Minos he says, "Who knows of enigmas? I attack." In fact, while conversing with Minos, who does know of enigmas and wields them deftly, Theseus finds himself susceptible to becoming more manipulative. He says, "Suddenly I find in myself a dangerous facility to spin words. Worse, I enjoy weaving them, see what follows, throw the nets. Oh, but I must stop myself." Theseus projects himself as a caricature of the iconic Greek hero because that's what he is expected to be. He is not cunning because he has never been expected to be cunning. He is supposed to be brave and athletic and righteous. This is the role he's been cast in, but he is also a king and he mirrors Minos in this. Minos, by contrast, puts more importance on cunning than bravery or righteousness. He has been a king for longer and has had to make more kingly decisions, such as who must be fed to the Minotaur. He tells Ariadne, on this day that returns every year with a ship of tears, on this day on which I must be king. He could never kill the Minotaur himself because he is too connected to him. It was not only to be used as a weapon that the Minotaur was kept alive. After all, Minos could have killed him in secret and simply kept up the ruse, as he plans to after Theseus. The Minotaur was kept alive because he was Minos' punishment from the gods. Minos himself could never have killed him, but Theseus could, and in so doing, Minos could be free. Ariadne is almost a ghost in this play, haunting the scenes of men. Minos comments that she speaks and sees through him as though she was alone, and truly she is alone. The only person she seems to care for is the Minotaur, and he's been imprisoned for years. Her love for the Minotaur is strange as well, and often harrowing. At one point, she calls him her secret lover. Honestly, Ariadne being in unrequited love with her brother would be par for the course for the Greeks. Every member of the family is in a prison of sorts. The Minotaur imprisoned by the labyrinth in his very existence, Minos imprisoned by the Minotaur, and Ariadne imprisoned by her role as bartering chip and her love for her brother. She does not simply want to escape Crete, she wants them both to escape together. The labyrinth in this play is described as white, dry, and endless. The Minotaur at one point mentions that he misses open water the most. He kept the Athenians and formed his own society within the labyrinth based around music and dancing. But in the end, the labyrinth was still a prison for them all. The labyrinth in Los Reyes reminds me of the labyrinth in the House of Asterion, a short story published in 1947 by fellow Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. I don't think it's unfair to think Cortázar was influenced by Borges. In both stories, the Minotaur is an introspective creature who ruminates on the endlessness of the labyrinth. For Borges' Asterion, this endlessness is a freedom. His labyrinth has no doors and no locks, and so he is not truly imprisoned. For Cortázar's Minotaur, the prison itself is endless. He will not suddenly be free by killing Theseus and following Ariadne's string out of the labyrinth. He can only be free by dying. Asterion in Borges' story also dies. Theseus, when recounting their meeting to Ariadne, says the Minotaur scarcely defended himself, so perhaps he felt more imprisoned than he let on. This version of the Minotaur is the most sympathetic on this list. He is a victim more than anything else, imprisoned because of what he is, not what he does. He is exceedingly introspective and philosophical. That he seems to view Ariadne's love as simply another chain is interesting. She seems convinced that he will kill Theseus and find his way from the labyrinth to be with her, but the Minotaur says to Theseus, escape to that other prison, the ultimate one, peopled horribly with her face and her peplos. The her referred to here is assumed to be Ariadne, and a peplos is a garment worn by ancient Greek women. Peopled horribly with her face is not how I would describe someone I loved. The Minotaur seems reluctant to and disinterested in reuniting with Ariadne. His conversation with Theseus is largely a philosophical one on the nature of existence as a prison. After all, because he is considered monstrous, the Minotaur will never be totally free from the constraints of people's prejudice, no matter where he goes. Then, he reasons, is death not the ultimate freedom for the likes of him? He would be freed from his body, free to roam the world forever as a boundless spirit. He romanticizes the act of death to himself, so he might feel as though it's a real choice rather than the only true option left to him. That he took care of the Athenians, even if only out of loneliness, shows that he was the least monstrous of the three kings in the play, this king of the labyrinth. After all, the Minotaur never killed anyone. The King Must Die by Mary Renault. In 1958, Mary Renault, known for her homoerotic novels about Alexander the Great, wrote an archaeologically and anthropologically plausible retelling of Theseus's life, from childhood to his return to Athens from Crete. The story is, like most of Renault's stories, told in first person, with an older Theseus narrating these chapters of his life. As a boy, Theseus is told that his father was Poseidon, which he believes until a bully points out Theseus' small stature, a sure sign that he isn't the son of a god. Now unsure of himself and with something to prove, Theseus becomes reckless and daring, hoping his unmatched bravery will convince everyone, and himself, of his status as Poseidon's son. In his adolescence, it's revealed that Theseus has the ability to sense when Poseidon is angry and plans to shake the earth and cause earthquakes. And, eventually, he learns that his father was not Poseidon but Aegis, the mortal king of Athens. Along his journey down the treacherous isthmus, the neck of land connecting the Peloponnese Peninsula to the rest of mainland Greece, Theseus is stopped by the queen of Eleusis. Eleusis is a matriarchal Minoan society with a ritual in which their king is killed as a sacrifice to the mother goddess, Gaia. This is done in the form of a wrestling match, and this year Theseus is the lucky pick for opponent. When asked what the rules are for combat, the queen says simply that the rule is the king must die. In the end, Theseus does kill the king and is crowned king in his place for the next year. He marries the queen and soon grows frustrated with the lack of power that he, as the king, is given. Theseus comes from a Hellenic patriarchal society. While he respects the mother goddess, his patron gods are Poseidon and Apollo. Over time, Theseus befriends his Minoan guards, many of whom are gay and somewhat into him, which Theseus finds amusing but inconsequential since he's a man for women. He forges friendships with the neighboring king and does a lot of kingly things that ultimately frees the Eleusinian men from their overbearing mothers and queen, who has at various points tried to kill him. Theseus then finally makes it to Athens, where Medea has again poisoned Aegis against him and poisoned his cup, only for the king to see Theseus' sword and recognize him as his son, pushing the cup from his hands. Theseus is, more than anything, disappointed by his father's attempt to kill his guest, a crime viewed as especially shameful and cowardly. When it's revealed that Medea and the Eleusinian queen have conspired to kill Theseus through Aegis, Medea makes a run for it, and Theseus gives chase. When he's just about to corner her, she casts a spell on him, paralyzing him with a fear he's never felt before or since, allowing her to escape. In the following weeks, Theseus travels between Athens, of which he is now the prince and heir, and Eleusia, of which he is still king. He builds a relationship with Aegis, which is its own distinct type of bittersweet. All his life, Theseus had craved a father, but now that he has one, Aegis can only be a disappointment compared to the fantasy in Theseus' head. Finally, the day of tribute comes when the Athenian sacrifices are chosen by lottery and sent away on Cretan ships. Theseus' Eleusinian guards are mistakenly placed into the lottery and, when he sees they won't be released, Theseus offers himself to the lottery too. But when the lottery is finished and he realizes Aegis had faked putting his son's name in the bowl, Theseus volunteers as tribute. He, alongside 6 other boys and 7 girls, are taken to Crete, and along the way they forge a bond of fellowship, knowing that each of their survival depends on the survival of the others. They are going to Crete to become a team of bull dancers. In Minoan civilization during the Bronze Age, bull leaping is thought to have been a ritual sport and/or performance in which athletes of all genders literally vaulted over bulls as part of a ceremonial rite. In The King Must Die, bull dancers are treated similarly to gladiators. They are bought and sold by various patrons and trained before engaging in the extremely dangerous performance for the entertainment of an audience. Bull dancers dance as a team, and the Athenians call themselves the Cranes. At their arrival to the Cretan port, Cretan courtiers look over them like racehorses they mean to bet on. One such noble, feared by the rest, is Asterion, the prince. Theseus insults Asterion, who insults him in turn, and then buys the Cranes as a whole and has them trained as a team, something which no other batch of sacrifices has done. They quickly become the best of the bull dancers, surviving an unprecedented 6 months with no grave injuries. They begin to train the new slaves brought into the bull court as they once were. The bull dancers all live and train together in the bull court, though the women are led to separate quarters every night. The bull court is in the palace of Knossos, a labyrinthine structure built by the famed architect Daedalus, who also constructed the wooden bull the dancers train on. Among the key players in Knossos is Ariadne, the goddess on earth, whom the Cretans believe to be the human incarnation of the mother goddess. She intrigues and is intrigued by Theseus from the beginning, and eventually they become lovers, often having to leave a trail of string to follow each other so as not to get lost in the palace. Theseus also discovers that Asterion is not really the son of King Minos, but the product of the queen's affair with a bull dancer who had also been the lover of Minos. Ariadne confesses to Theseus that Minos is sick with leprosy, which is why he never leaves his room and no one ever sees him. He is also dying, and she distrusts Asterion, who has been subtly gaining more power over the kingdom in an attempt to take the throne and force Ariadne to be his queen, though she is his sister. Eventually she introduces Theseus to her father, whom she pities, and Theseus grows to pity him too, understanding that as a king, Minos has had to make difficult choices. Minos aligns himself with Theseus over Asterion and makes Theseus promise to marry Ariadne and make her his queen in Athens. Theseus in turn uses this information and his role as a respected bull dancer to sow the seeds of revolution amongst his fellow dancers. They hide weapons and forge alliances with other dancers and people loyal to Minos. Secretly, Minos has Theseus behead him. When Asterion discovers the king's body, he discreetly moves to have himself crowned king. During a catastrophic earthquake which destroys most of the palace and wrecks the city, an earthquake which Theseus predicts and successfully saves most of his allies from, the revolt finally takes place. The dancers and Cretans rise up against Asterion and his armies and successfully overtake him, with Theseus dealing the final blow. The cranes and Ariadne then set sail for Naxos, where they are welcomed by the matriarchal queen and invited to stay for the next day's feast of Dionysus, at which their king will be sacrificed. Ariadne is excited for the feast, having never left Crete, and the next day is led to the sacred island with the queen, where the king is to be sacrificed. Theseus looks for her all day and night, though he does eventually get drunk and distracted with a threesome, while assuming Ariadne had found her own distraction for the night. Eventually, he sees the procession of women, bloodied and exhausted by the Bacchanalia, with 2 priests carrying Ariadne in a carriage between them. At first believing she has been hurt, he finds her sleeping peacefully, covered in blood and clutching something which makes Theseus sick. In the sequel, it's implied to be the dead king's genitals. The priests sympathetically inform Theseus that Ariadne has been marked by Dionysus, and Theseus dejectedly determines he must leave her behind on Naxos. After ensuring she'll be well treated and respected there, Theseus collects his people and they quietly depart in the night. Just before reaching Athens, Theseus recalls his father telling him to paint his returning sails white. Worried Aegis will take white sails as a sign to sacrifice himself, Theseus asks Poseidon what to do. He receives an answer: fly the black sails. Thus, Aegis sees the black sails and, believing his son is dead, throws himself into the sea, and Theseus becomes the king of Athens. This book is one of the most fascinating character studies I've ever read. Renault's Theseus is, I believe, the most realistic on this list. He is, by every ancient Greek definition, a hero, but he is also foolhardy, proud, and judgmental. His misogyny and racism is glaring, yet by ancient Greek standards, he's exceedingly open-minded, going so far as to instate laws prohibiting the mistreatment of women and slaves. Note, he does not outlaw slavery, because he sees nothing wrong with slavery, so long as the slaves themselves are not quote-unquote mistreated. He sleeps with slave women who could never begin to consent, but because he does not beat them and in some cases rescues them from harsher masters, he believes himself good to them. We are given these facts by Theseus himself, which makes him an inherently unreliable narrator. Renault writes this all with a deftness that allows us to relate to and root for Theseus as the protagonist while still acknowledging what we can understand to be huge character flaws and prejudices. Of course, Theseus, a 17-year-old prince raised in a patriarchal racist society, would be a racist misogynist, even if, compared to the men around him, he's progressive for his time. To whitewash him as a feminist would be revisionist, as would portraying him as a one-note barbarian. In the end, placing Theseus as the narrator serves to spotlight and critique the rampant naturalized misogyny of his society better than most feminist myth retellings ever manage. Minos hardly features in this story with just 2 speaking scenes, during one of which he dies. Ultimately, he's treated very sympathetically, since Theseus, our narrator, and Ariadne, the woman he loves, both sympathize with him. Making him sickly and physically weak, and thus largely powerless, makes it easy to forget that Minos was still the person who ultimately decided to demand the Athenian, and, as we see, countless other foreigners, as bull dancers for his own people's entertainment. Even when Theseus does remember this fact, he quickly forgives Minos. After all, as a king himself, Theseus has had to make hard decisions as well, and we already know it isn't slavery in itself that he disagrees with. Minos deciding when, where, and how exactly he dies is an affecting moment for Theseus. Throughout the book, a king consenting to self-sacrifice is a consistent theme. As a boy, Theseus' grandfather, the king of treason, tells him about the days when kings were regularly sacrificed if they failed to please the gods and ensure their people were cared for. A good king, it's argued, decides to die for his people. If he isn't willing, then he's no king at all. But a real king, a king who has a dialogue with their god, is the one who should decide when he dies. No one else should decide that for him. When Theseus comes upon the Eleusins, he is disturbed by the ritual which forces their king to be killed every year while he has no say in the matter. In fact, Theseus refuses to kill the king until he tells Theseus to finish things. Eventually, Theseus puts an end to the ritual, not only to save his own life, but because he genuinely believes a true sacrifice must be consented to and must be preceded by a sign from the gods. Likewise, Theseus is upset when he realizes the king of Naxos is meant to be sacrificed the next day, something which he does not seem to have agreed to. Minos' own consent to his death confirms for Theseus that he is on the correct path and that Minos was a true king after all. The running theme of a king dying at the hands of his people is especially interesting since in the original legend of Theseus, he also was killed as a result of the dissatisfaction of and his unpopularity with his people. Ariadne in this story is incredibly young, as is Theseus, who is mostly 17 and 18, at 16. And she does feel like a 16-year-old girl, albeit one who has been raised as a Cretan princess and goddess incarnate. Ariadne, like Theseus, is flawed. She's proud and self-centered and naive, like Theseus. The fact that their character flaws mirror each other fairly well, while being on the opposite ends of the gender performance spectrum, is fascinating to me. Theseus is at turns disappointed by and amused by Ariadne's self-centeredness and sheltered attitude, completely unaware that he has those flaws as well. When Ariadne admits that she makes up the prophecy she tells the Cretans and cannot actually hear the goddess anymore, Theseus is disappointed in her, being incredibly devout himself. Theseus never questions his signs from Poseidon, even though no one else has ever actually witnessed them, and they usually tell Theseus what he already believes. Renault writing the book in a plausible way meant she got rid of any actual appearances of the gods. Theseus' connection to Poseidon very well could be the invention of a little boy desperate for a father, grown into a very persistent delusion. Ariadne, on the other hand, suffers no such delusion. She knows she isn't speaking to gods, but she also knows that as the literal goddess on earth, her people need to believe that she is. If she doesn't uphold that role, there's no telling what will happen to her or her people should they suffer a massive cultural crisis of faith. In this way, she isn't being naive at all, but is surviving. That said, Ariadne's priorities are very self-serving. She never tries to help any of the bull dancers until she falls in love with Theseus. She doesn't fall in love with Theseus until he's proven his ability to survive and thrive. She doesn't show any sympathy for the other bull dancers or slaves, or the king of Naxos, even actively taking part in the bull dancing ritual and Naxos sacrifice. During the rebellion of Knossos, the Cretans scoop Ariadne up onto their shoulders, since, as their goddess, she should not touch the ground, and Ariadne enthusiastically cries for them to move forward into battle, a battle that she does not fight and has not truly worked for. Theseus briefly compares her, on the shoulders of rebelling slaves, to the Amazon general turned bull dancer beside him, a warrior woman who has worked with him towards the rebellion for weeks. During this comparison, for Theseus, a warrior himself, Ariadne comes up short. As a princess, she lived a life of luxury on the backs of gruesome practices. Now, as the victims of those practices are wrestling back their freedom, she is quite literally sitting on their backs, getting what she wants from them, the death of her brother. In the end, though, Theseus argues to himself that Ariadne has suffered as well, and so deserves to call for the death of her brother. After all, Theseus himself is a prince and king, also raised in a lap of luxury, also self-serving and reactionary. It's easy for him to forgive these flaws in her, because they are his flaws as well, even if he doesn't recognize them. This Ariadne, who is as developed and complex as Theseus's narration can allow her to be, has far less agency than F.L. Lucas's Ariadne. She is placed in the role of goddess incarnate by men, most notably her father and brother. She is traded from her father to Theseus, from daughter of a king to wife of a king. She is saved by Theseus, and then taken away from Crete by him. She is marked by Dionysus. Aside from her teen summer romance with Theseus, which initially starts when she has him brought to her secretly, Ariadne has very little to no input for any of these moments. But this all feels purposeful rather than unfeminist, since we are being given this story from the point of view of Theseus. I've seen a number of people insinuate or outright say that Mary Renault's depiction of women is misogynistic or prejudiced. This seems odd to me. First of all, if Renault's narrators are men, especially men from the age of antiquity, it would be outright jarring for them to view the women in their lives in a completely non-misogynistic way. And secondly, Mary Renault herself was a gender non-conforming lesbian, and I think cis straight women forget how often they are the villains in real-life stories of women like Mary Renault. Renault said her own mother wanted a real girl instead of Mary. She frequently told her gay men friends that she wished she had been born a man. This fraught relationship to gender has existed throughout lesbian and LGBT history. I completely understood Renault's complicated portrayal of women and femininity. Her women characters being flawed or antagonistic doesn't make them misogynistic caricatures, and her male narrators being misogynistic doesn't make Renault herself a misogynist. Take, for instance, her portrayal of Medea, which is the strongest version of her on this list. Though Medea is undoubtedly a villain, she is also very powerful and the only person to actually make Theseus fear for his life. The Minotaur, like the gods, were removed from The King Must Die so as to make the story more realistic and believable. Instead, Asterion is a human man and the bastard son of the queen. He isn't particularly complex as a character and really just exists as a direct antagonist for Theseus. The labyrinth in this book is the Palace of Knossos itself, a decision Renault based on real-life archaeologist Arthur Evans's work. Renault is a fantastic writer, so the labyrinthine palace is incredibly easy to picture as we read, peppered with plenty of genuine classical elements that make the world of the book feel as real as possible. If you have any interest in Greek mythology or historical fiction, or really just good literature in general, I highly recommend The King Must Die. Minotaur, the wild beast of Crete. The sword and sandal, or peplum subgenre, is a subgenre of Italian historical, mythological, or biblical films usually set in the Greco-Roman period. Defined by Robert Rushing, a peplum film, in its most stereotypical form, depicts muscle-bound heroes, professional bodybuilders, athletes, wrestlers, or brawny actors, in mythological antiquity, fighting fantastic monsters and saving scantily clad beauties. Rather than lavish epics set in the classical world, they are low-budget films that focus on the hero's extraordinary body. Most sword and sandal films feature a superhumanly strong male hero, along with two women vying for the affection of the hero, the good love interest, a damsel in distress needing rescue, and an evil femme fatale who wants to dominate the hero. The 1960 movie The Wild Beast of Crete is no exception. In this bodybuilder hero role, they cast real-life Olympic gold medalist Bob Matthias as Theseus. The plot of this movie varies quite a bit from the original myth. While Theseus is the prince of Athens, and Phaedra and Ariadne are the daughters of Minos and Pasiphae, and there is a Minotaur in Crete, that's about where the similarities end. To start, the Minotaur isn't the product of a union between the queen and bull. Instead, it was sent by Zeus, Jove in the film, to punish the people of Crete. Why? Well, there doesn't need to be a why. And Ariadne isn't the princess of Crete this time, that's her twin sister Phaedra, who actually did marry Theseus in the myths. Pasiphae is dying, and Minos sacrifices a Cretan virgin to the Minotaur, hoping to appease the gods so they'll save his wife. It doesn't work, and on her deathbed, the queen tells Minos and Phaedra that when Phaedra was born, she also had a twin sister named Ariadne. Pasiphae was supposed to sacrifice one of the twins to the Minotaur, but couldn't bear to, so she kept Phaedra and had Ariadne taken to be raised in a village on the mainland. Minos in this film is a real family man who doesn't actually like sacrificing people to the Minotaur and decides that, you know what, that isn't necessary anymore on account of how it didn't save my wife. So he really wants his secret daughter Ariadne found and brought to Crete. Phaedra also wants her sister found, she says, and killed. She sends the captain of the guard, Chiron, to do this. Theseus and his BFF Demetrio, meanwhile, come upon some bandits pillaging a village on their way to Athens, in a fantastic massacre scene in which absolutely no one bleeds. It's Chiron and his hired hands, obviously, and since Demetrio is Cretan too, Chiron has to hide so he doesn't get made. Theseus and Demetrio end up rescuing a sobbing Ariadne whose foster parents, which she thinks are her real parents, have just been bloodlessly killed. Crying and being rescued turns out to be her two major character traits. Theseus, taking a cue from Prince Eric, decides to just take Ariadne home to Athens where she can live in his father's house. This is funny, you see, since his father's house is the palace, which Ariadne doesn't know. Back in Crete, Minos is maybe being poisoned by Phaedra and his physician, or priest, it's hard to tell. Phaedra has anyone protesting her coup arrested and sacrificed to the Minotaur. She sends Chiron to Athens to complete the task which he's already failed once at. At Athens, Theseus introduces Ariadne to his dad, who seems totally chill with his son wanting to marry some village girl. Demetrio, who's Cretan, in case you forgot, keeps mentioning how much Ariadne looks like the Cretan princess Phaedra. He and Theseus throw a discus, together homoerotically. Theseus wants him to stay in Athens and flesh out their bromance, but Demetrio really misses his sister and dad. Ariadne, meanwhile, gets a makeover, which doesn't make her look any different. Chiron reappears during an Athenian party and pulls Demetrio aside, informing him that his dad and sister have been arrested and are set to be sacrificed if he doesn't kill Ariadne for Phaedra. Demetrio doesn't want to kill his bestie's new girlfriend, but he also doesn't want his dad and sister to die. When he sneaks into Ariadne's bedroom that night with a knife, he can't go through with it. Ariadne wakes up when he drops the knife, but doesn't scream because she doesn't do much of anything. Theseus joins them then because nobody sleeps in this palace, and Demetrio tells them about Chiron and Phaedra's threat. They still don't know why Phaedra wants Ariadne dead. Ariadne looking identical to her isn't enough of a clue, apparently, but Theseus and Demetrio decide to head to Crete to put a stop to it, while Theseus's dad promises to keep Ariadne safe in Athens. In Crete, Demetrio and Theseus go straight to Demetrio's pals, who are trying to determine how to rescue Minos from his daughter's malicious grasp. Phaedra has a spy in their group, though, so she knows they're here. She invites Theseus to come talk to her, where she promises to release Demetrio's family and stop the sacrifices if Theseus marries her instead of Ariadne. Theseus refuses, though only after kissing her, and she declares war. Demetrio and co are arrested and ready to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, but he and Theseus sword fight their way out of the palace, again with no blood, and then steal a couple of horses to run away. Demetrio is shot and ends up dying in Theseus's arms homoerotically. Then Theseus falls or jumps into the sea. I was baking a cake while watching this movie and couldn't pause the movie at all, so I missed the next 5 minutes or so while I pulled the cake from the oven. When I got back, Theseus was in an underwater cave or something, having been rescued by the sea goddess Amphitrite, who also wants Theseus to marry her. I have no idea why she wants that, and neither does Theseus. Apparently, he's been in a little ocean coma for a while, and Aegis has waged war against Crete and lost, and Phaedra has somehow gotten a hold of Ariadne. Theseus sneaks away back to Crete and rescues Ariadne again, right as Phaedra is about to feed her to hyenas. Phaedra ends up in the hyena pit instead, and when Chiron and his guards show up, Ariadne has to pretend to be Phaedra while Theseus is arrested. Now somewhat free, Ariadne as Phaedra finally gets to meet her dear old dad Minos, who only believes she's Ariadne when she starts crying on account of how Phaedra has never cried. Unfortunately, this also gives her away to Chiron, who tells her he knows the truth and will let her remain Phaedra and become the queen so long as she marries him. Lots of marriage threats in this movie. The sacrifices are led up to the labyrinth, but Theseus inspires the Cretans to rise up against the soldiers, and Chiron is killed in the riot. Theseus then goes into the labyrinth by himself to finally put an end to the threat of the Minotaur. Ariadne follows after him, using the embroidery thread from her gown to leave a trail through the maze so they can get out again. Finally, in the film's last 15 minutes, the titular Minotaur makes an appearance. It's worth the wait, a fun example of that campy stop-motion creature feature from the 50s and 60s that we all know and love. Theseus kills him, and he and Ariadne make their way back to the palace where Minos has also recovered and celebrates the final couple with everyone else. Minos is a victim in this movie in spite of the fact that, again, he was the one who decided to do the whole human sacrifice thing and could have stopped it at literally any point. He also seems to really love Ariadne, despite not even knowing she existed, an awful lot for a guy who couldn't care less about the death of the daughter he raised. Phaedra never cried. Maybe that was a red flag, dude. You should have invested in family therapy. Ariadne is boring and offensively annoying. Her talents include bad fake crying and smiling like a customer service representative. Using her embroidery thread to map their escape route is the first good decision she makes in the whole film, and she still ends up getting rescued. Phaedra is more interesting only because I have a weakness for femme fatales. She's otherwise just another one-note character, an evil but sexy seductress. I love evil women, but they must be interesting. Otherwise, it's just misogyny. The Minotaur in this movie is very fun, but unfortunately, if you blink, you might miss him. Also, he looks less like a Minotaur and more like a brown, abominable snowman, but I think that's kind of endearing. He's not scary at all, but none of the kill scenes involve blood, so are we really surprised? The labyrinth in this movie is nothing special and largely forgettable. It looks like a cheap set because that's what it is. All in all, while it wasn't completely unenjoyable, this isn't a movie I'd ever rewatch or recommend.